Welcome back to This Is a Commander channel, where this is a Commander channel, and today I'm going to be talking about Commander, Tough Rules, and Cool Interactions, episode 169. Today's episode is going to take a look at something that I feel will be a bit controversial for a lot of players, because it's one of those cases of the wording just being slightly different, and that making a massive difference, and it involves something that the normal thing that happens in most Commander games, if not all Commander games, and that's what makes this variation so difficult to grasp. I'm going to cover the easier part first, so if you want to skip ahead to the tougher part, then jump to the timestamp that you see now on screen. And now, let's jump straight into it. I first off want to start with the part that most players do understand correctly, but still a few may not know. And to show this, let's take a look at Marchesa the Black Rose. I personally have a Marchesa deck. Is it Marchesa or Marquesa? Which one are you? I usually say Marchesa. I personally have a Marchesa deck, and I do have to often explain that she does trigger herself. So let's read her last ability that says, whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it dies, return that card to the battlefield under your control at the beginning of the next instep. If she has a counter on her when she dies, she does in fact trigger herself. I think that sometimes players get a little confused by this because a lot of the times the abilities will use the word another, in which case they don't trigger themselves, like here on Wilhelt, or they have to specifically call themselves out on the card by name, like here on Omnath. But a card like Marchesa doesn't say the word another, and so she does trigger herself and can bring herself back. Oftentimes, when a player gets confused by this, wondering how a card can see itself die and then trigger while it's in the graveyard, I like to remind them that that's exactly how cards like Solemn Simulacrum work. His second ability would be useless if he could never see himself die. But why is this? How is it that a card can see themselves die and still trigger while they're in the graveyard? Well, this is because the rules specifically allow for it, and we can see that in the comprehensive rules under section 603.10 states that normally objects that exist immediately after an event are checked to see if the event matched any trigger conditions, and continuous effects that exist at the time are used to determine what the trigger conditions are and what the objects involved in the event look like. However, some triggered abilities are exceptions to this rule. The game looks back in time to determine if those abilities trigger, using the existence of those abilities and the appearance of objects immediately prior to the event. The list of exceptions are as follows. Man, that was a mouthful. And then we see the list of some of the exceptions, and the very first one that they provide is CR 603.10a that says, some zone change triggers look back in time. These are leave the battlefield abilities, abilities that trigger when a card leaves a graveyard, and abilities that trigger when an object that all players can see is put into a hand or library. And so, because of this, cards like Marchesa and Solemn Simulacrum can die in that they go from the battlefield to the graveyard, and while in the graveyard, their abilities can look back at the state of the game immediately before that and see that, oh hey, I used to be on the battlefield and now I'm here in the graveyard, so I will trigger. Okay, so that was the easy part of the video. Hopefully wasn't too crazy for most of y'all viewing this, but now we get to the part that is the controversial part, the part that most players, I would imagine, are unaware of. So let's take a look at the popular commander Sephirus of the Hidden Ways, and we only care about her first triggered ability, and it says, whenever one or more creature cards are put into your graveyard from anywhere, venture into the dungeon. This ability triggers only once each turn. So the wording there is whenever one or more creature cards are put into your graveyard from anywhere. This means that if you discard your sad robot from hand, Sephirus will trigger. If the robot is milled from library to graveyard, she will trigger. If he is cast to the stack and then countered, then he's going from the stack to the graveyard, and she will trigger. And of course, if your Simulacrum is on the battlefield and is then destroyed, your Sephirus will trigger, as will your Simulacrum to draw a card. However, let's say your opponent casts Curtain's Call, and they target both your Simulacrum and your Sephirus, and that resolves destroying them both. What happens now? Will your Simulacrum trigger to draw you a card? Yes, but then what about your Sephirus? Will she trigger from seeing your Simulacrum dying? And in this case, no. She will not trigger. In fact, Sephirus herself dying doesn't trigger herself. And it's not because she uses the wording of another for creatures dying. She doesn't use that word at all in her ability. It's because she uses the wording put into your graveyard from anywhere. And you might be a tad confused because the Simulacrum says that it triggers whenever it dies, and if we look at the rules for that definition of dies, we can see in CR 700.4 that the term dies means is put into a graveyard from the battlefield. And if Sephirus is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, she is dying. So why is there a difference here? To understand this, we must look at one last bit of comprehensive rules, and that is from section 603.6c, that states that leaves the battlefield abilities trigger when a permanent moves from the battlefield to another zone. These are written as, but aren't limited to, when this object leaves the battlefield, or whenever something is put into a graveyard from the battlefield. An ability that attempts to do something to the card that left the battlefield checks for it only in the first zone that it went to. An ability that triggers when a card is put into a certain zone from anywhere is never treated as a leaves the battlefield ability, even if an object is put into that zone from the battlefield. So clearly, that last little bit there is why all of this happens. The game only provides the ability to look back in time to leaves the battlefield abilities, but because of the wording from anywhere, an ability is not considered to be a leaves the battlefield ability, no matter where that object came from before it entered the graveyard. I know that this can hurt your brain. It's one of those things that even once you know the rule, it might not make sense, and you just have to know that it doesn't work because the rules say it doesn't work. I'll provide some more examples of cards that see play in Commander in case you happen to be running these cards in your own decks, as some of them, their original text printed on the card don't make it clear that they are these kind of abilities, and it's only their Oracle text that does it, but not all these cards. One of the more common ones, Bloodchief Ascension's second triggered ability says that whenever a card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, this card sees a whole lot of play. That was actually the end of the ability that I'm going to say. This card, it sees a whole lot of play as it's very powerful, but if it were destroyed at the same time as other permanents on your opponent's battlefield, like if a player cast the card onto Inversion that destroys all non-land permanents, then it will not see any of them, and it will not trigger for any of them. A card like Planar Void sees play for cheap Graveyard Hate, it's only 1 mana, and surprisingly, it doesn't show up at all on the EDH rec page for Sir Conrad decks, which is kind of crazy to me for how much work it can do for just 1 mana. Anyhow, it says that whenever another card is put into a graveyard from anywhere, exile that card. Interesting that it's the Oracle text that I just read there, and it does specify that it's whenever another card triggers it. So that Oracle kind of makes it a little more clear that it doesn't trigger itself, but the card has only ever been printed the one time in Urza's Saga, so the wording on the card that is printed doesn't make it entirely clear that it's a from anywhere trigger, but it is. Interesting things to note for Planar Void: if an opponent were to use a card to destroy the Void, what happens? Will their Disenchant be removed from the Void's triggered ability? In Magic, the effects of a card resolve first before it goes to the graveyard, so that means that the Void would be destroyed going to the graveyard, not triggering itself, and then the Disenchant would go to the graveyard and stay there because the Void and its ability are no longer on the battlefield to see that Disenchant go to the graveyard. Also, speaking of Sir Conrad, we can see that his wording is done so in a way to care about both sides of this issue. He triggers both whenever another creature dies, so that is a leaves the battlefield trigger now because of that wording. And even it sees creature tokens dying because it just says whenever a creature dies. And then he also cares about a creature card going to the graveyard from anywhere. So if he dies in the same event as a bunch of other creatures due to something like that onto inversion, then he will see them all dying and he'll trigger. I'll mention 2 more cards just to be sure. Compost is an enchantment that says, whenever a black card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, you may draw a card. And then the Gitrog monster is a creature that says, whenever 1 or more land cards are put into your graveyard from anywhere, draw a card. So you've got these cards out, and an opponent casts that onto inversion. Or in the case of the Gitrog monster, maybe they cast something like a Jokalops, or Yakalops, or Jukulops, however you pronounce it, or a card like Obliterate. Then your Compost and Gitrog will net you 0 cards drawn, all because they say from anywhere. Have any of you personally been playing this wrong? Don't feel embarrassed to admit it. That's literally why this series of videos exists, because this game is complex and words can be very specific in Magic the Gathering. My personal play group, they actually we have a player that made a Sephiroth deck back when it was first printed, and explaining this to the play group was not easy the very first time we encountered it in a game, because it's just weird to say that. Even now, like after making the video, it's just like a weird concept that like it says if this would go to the graveyard from anywhere, that this triggers, but then it goes to the graveyard from the battlefield, one of the most common places that creatures go to the graveyard from, and it doesn't trigger. Just a weird thing. Are there other cards that you guys can think of, like Crawling Sensation and Crawling Infestation? That was interesting when looking this up. I didn't know there was these 2 crawling cards that were printed fairly recently, for one of them at least. Any of these other kind of cards that have the from anywhere wording on them that you might end up running in your decks that now you're aware of, oh, a board wipe of this kind wouldn't actually trigger this card. Anyhow, that's all I've got for today's episode. As always, I hope that all of you have found this video to be entertaining at least, and I hope that a few of you have even learned something about the crazy rules in this great game of Magic. Have a good one. Ta-ta! And hopefully the storm going on outside has not been too loud and distracting. It's been very windy all day. Trash has been floating around in the parking lot, so yep. Hope you guys enjoyed it and that storm's not too loud. Y'all have a good one. Ta-ta.